with the light of who you are. So let there be light.
Good to see you. Wasn't too sure who'd be here this morning, but it's lovely to see you all, and Happy New Year. I hope it's a good one. So, when was the last time you heard a sermon on giving? I reckon it'd be quite a while. I'm not too sure if I can recall ever hearing a sermon on giving in this church, and I've been in this church for nearly 20 years. There may have been one. Maybe I wasn't here, maybe I didn't listen, or maybe there just wasn't one. I don't know. I do recall hearing semi-regular sermons on giving at my old church in Sydney back in the 1970s and 1980s, but I really can't recall hearing too many after that. And I must say that I don't remember those sermons leaving me feeling terribly comfortable after listening to them. It's a subject that we tend to avoid now if we can, but yet it's a subject that's integral to our very existence, not just as a church, but as a society as a whole. So why then is it that it makes us feel uncomfortable to talk about? We all give various things in some way, in some shape or some form, but yet we don't like to talk about it very much. It's a very personal thing. I can't talk about other cultures, but in our own culture, we don't like to talk about it. So why then, you might ask, are you going to talk about giving now, Poulden? Did someone put me up to it? Was I coerced into talking about it? No, I wasn't coerced into talking about it. And yes, someone did put me up to it, but probably not who you think. When Jeremy contacted me a couple of weeks ago to see if I would be available to speak this morning, I agreed and I asked what the topic would be. That's how it works. When I preach on a topic that's given to me. Well, he said there's no topic. He said, let's just see where God leads. Well, this is where God led. The topic actually came up in a conversation that I was having with a couple of people. And it was then that I got that touch from the Lord. Now, you know when you get that touch from the Lord. Bang, got that touch. And I just went, no. And God said, yes. And he said, it'll be okay. I'll help you write it, which is what he always does. Normally when I'm preparing a sermon, I just sit down on my computer and I start typing and God feeds. That's the way it works with me. So if you don't like what you hear this morning, it's not my fault. But you do need to know that I did run it by the pastor. He said that would be great. It's one thing to get a nod from God, but you also still need a nod from the pastor. Now, we live in a society that is actually pretty generous. There are many charities that we give to the point where many of them have become more of an industry than a charity. We're constantly being hounded on the phone or in the media to give to this charity or to that cause, and they do it because they know we'll give. That's what we do. We give. We're forever hearing about these GoFundMe pages to help people who've had some sort of tragedy or other. I saw one the other day on the news where a man had been involved in a serious motorcycle accident in Bali, and it was going to cost $100,000, over $100,000 for his family to bring him back home. So what did they do? They set up a GoFundMe page. Within a couple of hours, they'd already raised $42,000, and I heard just the other day that they're well over the 100 already. That's in a week. GoFundMe pages. People give. Australians are a pretty generous lot. But I should probably say that maybe it's not just us. I think right round the world, people continue to give to all sorts of charities and causes because around the world it's seen as something that's important. But this morning I want to narrow it down a little bit. I want to take a look at giving within the church. And before you begin to groan in discomfort, I want you to know that I'm not here to hound you for you to put more money in the plate each week, although that would be nice. I believe that God wants to take us on a journey, just a short journey, so you can rest easy, on the importance of giving within the church and where it all began. We first begin to hear about it way back in the Old Testament, in Leviticus, and you know what? I've preached this sermon 5 times and I've never yet been able to say Leviticus. I just said it. How about that? Now, Leviticus chapter 27, verse 30, it says, a tithe, or a tenth tithe, a tithe of everything from the land, whether grain from the soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. Wow, that's enough to scare you away right there. A tenth of everything. But if you're not scared yet, you will be, because it goes on to say in verses 31 to 34, if a man redeems any part of his tithe, he must add a fifth to the value of it. So what's that all about? Goes on to say the entire tithe of the herd and flock, every 10th animal that passes under the shepherd's rod, will be holy to the Lord. He must not pick out the good from the bad or make any substitution. If he does make a substitution, both the animal and its substitute become holy and cannot be redeemed. These are the commands the Lord gave Moses on Mount Sinai for the Israelites. Well, if you're still here, I'd like to keep it that way, so I've decided not to read the next passage, and that's a passage from Deuteronomy 14, 22 to 29, because I'm quite sure if I read that, you'll all get up and head for the door, never to return. If you think the passage from Leviticus was complicated, then the one from Deuteronomy just takes the word complicated to a whole new level. The only respite that's in there is in the last part of verse 34 in Leviticus, where it says, these are the commands the Lord gave Moses on Mount Sinai for the Israelites. Whew. Thank goodness for that. It's okay. I'm not an Israelite. I'm just a common garden Gentile. And hopefully that doesn't apply to me. Any Israelites here this morning? Tough luck to you, eh? In the Old Testament covenant, God made with the Israelites, giving was a serious business, and it was as complicated as all heck. My eyes just started to glaze over as I read through all the rules and regulations that one had to abide by. And I remember back in the day when I first heard the odd sermon on giving, and all it was mentioned, I was thinking of bailing out right there and then. The only other respite was that these guys were farmers back then. And I wasn't. I'm a wage earner, still am. I didn't have flocks or herds or fruit trees or crops in the ground. But just west of Sydney, where I was back then, over the Blue Mountains, there are plenty of farmers out there, plenty of Christian farmers out there, and I was wondering how they got on. I was sort of hoping that their churches had big car parks so they could fit in the tenth of their herds and their flocks and their crops and everything else when it came time to pay their tithe. Now, I know I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, which is pretty normal for me, but I found this all a bit daunting and not just a little bit scary. This was being preached back there, 1970s, 1980s, a little bit into the 90s. You must be giving your tithe. It was essential that you give your tithe. There was no argument. But there was a problem. The problem was many people weren't giving a tithe. Many people weren't giving a tithe even though they were making out they were giving a tithe. And I reckon I may have even been guilty of that on the odd occasion, and quite possibly on the odd even occasion as well. Someone would be talking about tithing and I'd just be nodding along with them in agreement. You see, while I was giving, I wasn't tithing, I simply couldn't afford to. Something I do remember from back then is that there were some people who did like talking about tithing. It was almost like a badge of honour for some. It was almost like something to be proud of. This was by no means everybody, not at all, but it was certainly some people. And I've got to say, I didn't much like being around these people, not because they were yucky people, just because I felt guilty I felt like I wasn't living up to the expectations of the church. But whose expectations? Were they people's expectations or were they God's expectations? There's that old saying that the Lord loves a cheerful giver. That's in Corinthians. But I can guarantee that there were, and probably still are, plenty of people who were and are giving out of a sense of duty and were and are not cheerful about it. That was me for many years. I was giving out of a sense of duty, which made me ask the question, was God blessing my offering? Was he blessing my offering? I'm not too sure the answer to that. Maybe someone can shed some light to me on that afterwards. I find it interesting now, though, that after all those years of semi-regular sermons on giving and tithing, that it's a topic that we still like to avoid like the plague. We avoid speaking about giving and we totally ignore the T word, the tithing word, altogether. But you know what? I'm looking out here this morning and I guarantee that there are plenty of people here today who still tithe. And talking about tithing, there was always the question of whether you tithe gross or you tithe net, whether you tithe before tax or you tithe after tax. Some said it was okay to tithe after tax. And then there were those awful hardliners who said, no, it must be before tax. It was so complicated. Except it wasn't complicated for me because I wasn't tithing. No complication at all. But I'm not here to talk about tithing so much as I'm here to talk about giving. If you still tithe, well, God bless you. If you don't tithe but you give in other ways, God bless you. If you're not giving at all, I still pray that God will bless you. But can I also encourage you to think about giving? I said earlier that giving is an integral part of our church life. If we're not giving here, then we don't have a senior pastor. If we're not giving, then we don't have a children's pastor. If we're not giving, then we don't have a church administrator. And I can tell you, administering a church these days is a very complicated affair. If we're not giving, then we don't have a church building. If we're not giving, then we don't have a church. If we're not giving, then where is Christ's bride? So apart from the church not existing without us giving, why else should we give? Well, Jeremy hit the nail on the head in his sermon 2 weeks ago, John 3:16. Now, this verse we've used many times in sermons last year. I probably used it in 3 of my sermons and it's been used in plenty of others last year. And it's the basis of what giving is all about. It's because God gave first. And he also gave the most. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son. It is the ultimate in giving. It was the ultimate sacrifice. So how can we possibly accept his gift and then not give back? We do it. We do it all the time, and we do it in many ways. God wants us to give. He doesn't need our offerings. He can do quite nicely on his own, thank you very much. He wants us to give for each other just as he gives to us. So then, how do we give? How much do we give? The concept of tithing came out of the Old Testament, and it was basically a command. Give 1/10 of everything that you have, but it's a concept that's carried right through to the 20th century. But is it something that's relevant now in the 21st century? The truth is that if everyone in the church was still tithing, the church's coffers would be full and overflowing, and there would be cash in abundance to help the poor and the needy, and plenty of left over to have as multiple pastors and have all the mod cons in use in our services. But that's not the reality. The reality is the church is struggling financially. Our own little church here is a mile away from meeting our budget. And if this were a business, we probably would have been declared insolvent by now. But we're not a business. We're a small part of God's greater family. And we're still here. We're still here. As if by some greater doing, as if by some great miracle, we are still here. You know, Jesus was asked by the Pharisees about giving in Matthew chapter 22, but it was actually a setup. They were setting him up. Pharisees constantly tried to trip Jesus up. They should have really known better. In verse 16, they said to Jesus, "Teacher, we know you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth," which is a load of malarkey, because it's not what they thought at all. Pack of fibbers. They went on. "You aren't swayed by men because you pay no attention to who they are." Now, they got that bit right, but it was a bit of buttering up. I reckon it fell on deaf ears, though. "Tell us the truth," they said. "What is your opinion? Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Well, Jesus sees right through their little trap. He tells them to show him a coin, and he asks them whose inscription's on it. "Well, Caesar's," they say. Now, this is what I like best. His answer for them is gold. He says, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's." You see, Caesar, or his cronies, the tax collectors, would tell you what tax you must pay. But Jesus didn't do anything of the sort. He doesn't tell us what to give or how much to give. He only says, "Give to God what is God's." And I love that answer because it doesn't question whether or not we should give to God. He just says, "Give to God. Give to God." That's all of us. It's totally inclusive. It's not saying only some of us are required to give to God. It's saying that's all of us. So if you're asking me if we're commanded by God to give, then my answer to you is yes, I believe we are. He wants us to give. You might say that I can't afford to tithe, and it's interesting because once I was told by a pastor in a church in Sydney many years ago that he actually couldn't afford not to tithe. That was his life's experience. But we still have to remember that tithing is old covenant, and we are under a new covenant. So does the new covenant extend to tithing? Well, Jesus didn't talk about it. And I had a pretty thorough look right through the New Testament, and I couldn't find a single thing about tithing anywhere in the New Testament. But in 2 Corinthians, we are given a little bit of guidance about giving. We're reminded in chapter 9, verse 6, that whoever sows sparingly will reap sparingly. So, you know, that's a bit of a warning for us. Whoever sows sparingly will reap sparingly. That's a warning. But in verse 7, I think we reach pay dirt. It says, "Each person should give what they have decided in their heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion." And here we go, "For God loves a cheerful giver." You see, what you give to God is between you and him. It's a very personal, very private thing. That's why we don't like talking about it. It's a thing that we must commit to him and let ourselves be guided by him. And if that's a tithe, either gross or net, or it's something totally different, then that's what it is. And that's all God requires from you, and nothing more. Now, if you still feel a little bit nervous about that, there is further assurance in verse 8 of chapter 9 in 2 Corinthians, which says, "And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need will abound in every good work." So I hope I haven't left you quaking in your boots by the sermons of old. However, if you've ever wondered if God requires you to give, then yes, he does. If you're wondering what it is he wants you to give, ask him. He will tell you. And just don't think it's going to be a dollar figure, because there are so many other ways that we can give to God, and he has an amazing imagination. But please, and I'm going to be very, very blunt here, so put your seatbelts on. If you consider yourself a part of the church family here at Nowra Church of Christ, and you're not contributing in some way, then why not? We need you. We need your gifts, both financially and in so many other ways. God doesn't. God doesn't need your money, but we do. God doesn't need your gifts, but we do. You see, everything we have, God gave us. Don't think for a moment that you earned anything. Everything we have, God gave us, and He expects us to share around. I'll end in a very short story that some of you have already heard, but if you haven't, this story's for you. And that's because the roads that God leads us down are not just for ourselves. They're for us to share. They're for everyone. Quite a lot of years ago now, I lost my job. And we went from being a 2-income family with 5 teenage kids living at home that were struggling to make ends meet each week to being a single-income family with 5 teenagers at home that was struggling even more to make ends meet. And I was left with a problem one Sunday morning, and that was whether or not I should tithe our single income that morning or register our people mover car the next day. Couldn't do both. Did not have the money. So I did the only thing I could do, and that was I asked God, what do I do? What should I do? And very quickly and very audibly, I got the answer, and his answer was, either you trust me or you don't. Now, he said that because we'd already had this conversation previously when I lost my job. Either you trust me or you don't. Trust me, though. So that Sunday morning, I said, Lord, I trust you. And I placed our tithe in the offering bag that Sunday morning, back when we used to have offering bags. And I was wondering, okay, what's God going to do? I didn't have to wait a great deal of time. The answer came that evening when I was back at church, and I was handed an envelope after the church service with our name written on it. Someone had placed that offering in the offering bag with our name on it. To this day, I do not know who it was, but if you're here today, God bless you. In that envelope was more cash than I had put in the plate that morning, and so the next day I was able to register our car. Either you trust me or you don't. You see, God didn't need my cash. He needed me. He needed me to trust him in all things. And a part of that was giving when I didn't think that I had anything to give. And that is my message to you today. Everything we think we have, and we think it's ours, it isn't. But it is ours to share. Giving is a part of who we are in Christ. It's a part of our worship. It's a part of our faith walk. Giving is a faith thing. If you get to the end of your week and you have nothing left to give, to put into that plate or to do anything else, tell God about it. Tell God about it. And I can guarantee you that he will give you something to give. I was out of work for 8 months. We always had food on our table. I always had the bills paid. I always had the car on the road, and I always had money left over to give. That's faith, but that's God's miracle of giving. It's an amazing thing. Can I encourage us all to ask God how he would like us to give, and when he answers, and he will, to give cheerfully, because he loves the cheerful giver. Well, this message is concluded. We made it. I hope that there is something in there for you, and I really do thank you all for not walking out partway through.
Lord, I want to be